Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Oregon, a serial killer case. In the late 1960s, the Oregon State Police became aware that a number of young women were just suddenly going missing, essentially vanishing without a trace, and the detectives had no idea what had happened to them. But eventually it emerged that these poor women had been the victims of foul play, and they'd all been murdered by the same individual. There was a serial murderer on the loose, and through different lines of inquiry, the police were able to identify a top suspect in these brutal killings. And it came to light just how sadistic and depraved this predator truly was. This was a killer that didn't just enjoy the act of taking someone's life, he enjoyed essentially treating his victims like toys, like dolls. He would dress them up and force them to pose for photographs, but the thing that he took pleasure in the absolute most was seeing his victims wearing high-heeled shoes. Nothing brought him more sexual gratification than that. Join me as we delve into the chilling case of Jerry Brudos, otherwise known as the shoe fetish slayer. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a big thank you to Magellan TV for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Now, I actually signed up to Magellan TV a good few years ago now, I want to say, so I was so excited when they reached out and asked to partner with me. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service that offers literally thousands of gripping and compelling documentaries for you to watch across a number of different genres. They have documentaries about space, history, travel, nature, Earth, and so many more topics. And I'm sure that it will come as no shock to you guys that my personal favourite genre on Magellan TV is their true crime section. I really have been making my way through it. And I wanted to share the most recent documentary that I watched with you because, oh my god, it is wild. It's called Sleepwalkers Who Kill, and it's about people who sleepwalk that suddenly seem to turn violent in their sleep. And one case that the documentary discusses is that of Michael Rickskers, a man from Pennsylvania who suffered with sleep apnea. And one night in December of 1993, Michael shot and killed his wife and the mother of his children, Janet Rickskers. Michael was charged with murder, and during his trial, his defense was that he shot his wife in his sleep. He said that he just suddenly woke up to the sound of a gunshot, he looked down, and there was a gun in his hand and his wife was bleeding out. But despite this story, he was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury weren't buying that this was an accident. And there are other cases of a similar nature that this documentary covers, cases where sleepwalkers have attacked their partner in their sleep and they have no idea that they're doing it. And I just think it's so interesting because you often hear of people like shouting in their sleep, having conversations, getting out of bed and walking around. But it's crazy to learn about seemingly normal, good people who just seem to turn almost murderous in their sleep. I highly recommend you guys give it a watch. And what's so great about Magellan TV is that they are ad-free, so you can watch your documentaries without any disruptions, and their content library is constantly growing. They add new documentaries to their service every single week, and they are accessible anytime, anywhere. You can watch on your phone, on your laptop, on your TV. So if you would like to check out Magellan TV for yourself, then now is the time to do it, because if you click on the link in my description box, you will be able to claim a special offer of a 30-day free trial. So head to the link down below, get your free trial. Thank you so much once again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you, of course, to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, necrophilia, torture, and child abuse and neglect. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 5.5 decades now to the late 60s in Oregon, which is obviously a state in the US. However, Jerry Brudos' story begins even earlier than that, way back in the 1930s, on the 31st of January 1939, which is the day that he was born. Jerome Henry Brudos was born to parents Henry and Eileen Brudos in Webster, which is a city in South Dakota, and he was one of 2 children. He had an older brother named Larry. Now, the Brudos family didn't stay in South Dakota for very long. Jerry's father, Henry, kind of moved them around a lot. They were always moving to different areas in the US. And as I understand it, this was because he had a kind of seasonal job, so he had to constantly relocate to find work to support the family whilst his wife Eileen looked after the kids. So it was a bit of an unstable and unsettled childhood for the Brudos brothers, to be honest. Larry and Jerry always being moved from one town to another, one school to another, although eventually the family did settle in the state of Oregon. But Jerry Brudos' childhood was not just unsettling as a result of the constant moves to new places. It was also unpleasant because his parents were abusive towards him. Well, it was more so his mother, Eileen, really. She very much saw herself as the head of the family, I think. She was the matriarch. And while she absolutely doted on her eldest son, Larry, she pretty much despised her youngest child, Jerry. The reason being simply because he wasn't a girl. When she became pregnant with her second child, she was desperate for it to be a girl. She wanted a daughter because she already had a son. So when Jerry came along and he was obviously a boy, she was furious and she resented Jerry for this his whole life. All throughout his childhood, she would make it clear just how disappointed she was that he was born a boy. Whereas, like I said, with his older brother Larry, she was the complete and utter opposite. In her eyes, Larry could do no wrong. He was an angel. But Jerry was always very much treated like the runt of the litter by Eileen. She would constantly belittle him and bully him, to be honest, which is just awful, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine growing up knowing that your mother despises you simply because of your biological sex, something which you cannot help? And so naturally, as you would expect, this had such a mental impact on Jerry. He would be forced to watch his brother receive all of this love and care and attention from their mother, and he never really got that himself. And this was only made worse by the fact that Larry was quite an intelligent young boy who always did really well in school, whereas Jerry was always quite average in school, got quite average grades, and Eileen would again favour Larry because of this. It was in all aspects of his life, really. Jerry Brudos grew up always feeling, I guess, worthless to his mother. She was so critical of everything that he did. But there was one particular incident in Jerry Brudos' childhood in which his mother scolded him, which seemed to stand out from the rest and would mark the beginning of a certain fascination for Jerry Brudos that would eventually develop into a fetish. Basically, one day when Jerry was just 5 years old, he was on his own and he was walking around this local junkyard when all of a sudden he spotted this pair of leather high-heeled shoes with rhinestones on them. And it was almost like as soon as he saw them, he was mesmerized. There was something about these shoes that just really caught his eye. And so, being a 5-year-old boy, he decided to just pick them up and take these high heels home with him. And when he got home, he put them on his feet and he showed his mother, Eileen. And his mother was horrified. Apparently, Eileen Brudos was not the type to, wear shoes like that. Sources described her as having a very kind of conservative fashion sense, and she disapproved of this style of shoe, and so she immediately ordered her son to take the shoes off and get rid of them, throw them away. But as I said, Jerry was so fascinated by these high heels that he didn't want to get rid of them. He really liked them. He wanted to keep them, and so he did. He decided that he was going to hide them from his mother, and every so often he would put them on again and strut around in them. But of course, his mother soon found out that he hadn't thrown them away, and she became very angry at this. So angry, in fact, that she forced her 5-year-old son to watch as she burned these high-heeled shoes in front of him. And understandably, Jerry just couldn't make sense of this. He couldn't understand why his mother reacted in this way, why high heels became almost a taboo. He didn't know what was so wrong with him having these high heels, just that it was wrong in his mother's eyes. And it's believed that this event in his early life triggered something in young Jerry Brudos' brain, and it was almost like the fact that his mother made clear that high heels was something that he shouldn't like or want only made him want them even more and like them even more, and he started to develop this fixation fixation and obsession with women's footwear, specifically high heels and stilettos. There was one incident when Jerry was at school and he tried to steal his teacher's high-heeled shoes. Another time he tried to steal the shoes off of this young girl who I think was the daughter of a family friend of Henry and Eileen Brudos. One day this young girl was sleeping on a bed in the Brudos' home and she woke up to Jerry trying to remove her shoes off of her feet. And as Jerry got older, as he entered his teenage years and started to obviously go through puberty, he started to associate this obsession that he had with women's high heels with feelings of a sexual nature. He realized that women's shoes made him sexually aroused. He had a shoe fetish, and not just shoes anymore. He also started to develop an obsession with women's underwear. When he was a teenager, he would constantly secretly watch his neighbors who were teenage girls, and often when no one was looking, he would steal their underwear from their washing line and he would take them home and wear them. He enjoyed wearing his neighbor's underwear because, again, that brought him arousal. And it was well known in the neighborhood that some creep was going around people's gardens and stealing their underwear. Of course, we know that it was Jerry Brudos, but no one else knew this at the time. And one day, when Jerry was just 17 years old, he decided to invite one of the teenage girls who lived in the neighborhood round to his house, telling her that he worked for the police and that they could chat about the underwear thief. And when she arrived, Jerry let her in, and then once she was inside, he said that he had to go and that he would be back shortly. He went into another room and he put on this mask, this terrifying mask, and then he went back to this young girl armed with a knife. He threatened her at knife point and ordered her to remove all of her clothing, and once she had, he proceeded to take photographs of her while she stood in front of him naked. She must have been absolutely terrified. He then left the room, removed this mask, walked back in and pretended to this girl that this stranger had just locked him in the barn outside and that the stranger was the masked figure who had attacked her and threatened her with a knife. It wasn't him. Of course, this girl wasn't stupid. She didn't believe Jerry and she quickly fled the house, although she didn't go to the police about this attack at the time. But this seemed to mark a turning point for Jerry Brudos. As we know, he had a shoe fetish and an underwear fetish. He'd been stealing underwear and shoes for a while. And on top of that, he had violent sexual fantasies about having power and control over women, being able to force women to do what he wanted, like strip in front of him and photograph them in their underwear. And now at 17 years old, he has turned that fantasy into a reality with this attack on his neighbor, an attack that would be the first of many that he would go on to commit. Now, as I said, this girl didn't report what Jerry Brudos had done to the police at the time. Perhaps she was just too scared to because he was her neighbor. So Jerry didn't face any punishment for this. So in his mind, he's thinking, well, great, I've gotten away with it. My first attack on a woman and I haven't gotten into trouble. So this would have given him the confidence to go on and attack again, attack someone else. And so he did. Just 8 months after he assaulted his neighbor, Jerry Brudos was driving around in his car when he offered this other teenage girl a lift back to her house, and so she accepted this lift and she got into his car, but of course that wasn't his intention at all. He didn't drive her home. Instead, he took her to this deserted, remote farmland area, and it was there where he ordered her to remove all of her clothing so that, again, he could take pictures of her. However, this girl said no, she refused to strip for Brudos, which made him angry, and so he responded to this by viciously beating her. Now, thankfully, as he was doing this, as he was beating her, a couple who were in their car drove past and they saw what was going on. They were able to help this girl and call the police, and Jerry Brudos was arrested. This was in the spring of 1956, so when he was about 18 years old. But despite how violent this attack was, Jerry Brudos wasn't sent to prison, it was actually decided that he would be sent to the Oregon State Hospital to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. And whilst he was in the hospital, his home was searched, and that was when the police discovered the Polaroid pictures that he had taken himself of that neighbour that he attacked whilst he was wearing a mask. So I mean, it became clear to the police that he was a very, very disturbed young man. Although, having said that, when doctors examined him at the hospital, they decided that this was basically just a phase that Jerry Brudos was going through. He'd literally attacked 2 women, and they were just kind of like, oh wow, he's a young boy, he's going through puberty, this will eventually pass, he'll grow out of this. They came to this conclusion despite the fact that it was very obvious to them that Jerry Brudos had this hatred of women, which had kind of stemmed from his hatred of his own mother, Eileen. And despite the fact that Brudos openly admitted to his doctors that he had this fantasy of wanting to build his own underground prison where he could keep young girls and women against their will and assault them whenever he wanted to. The doctors concluded that Brudos showed signs that he may have been suffering from schizophrenia, but all in all, they didn't think that anything was seriously wrong with him. He wasn't so mentally ill that he couldn't be released back into society. How on earth they came to this conclusion is beyond me, to be honest. This man has literally said that he wants to hold women hostage in his own prison, and they're just like, oh, it's a phase, he'll grow out of it. What the hell? But yeah, that was the results of his psychiatric evaluation. Now, he was admitted into the hospital for about 9 months. He was forced to stay there whilst he underwent all of these assessments, but they did allow him to go out in the day. He would be allowed to go to school in the day, and then he would have to return at night and sleep at the hospital. But by early 1957, he'd been discharged and sent back home to live with his family, and that same year he graduated high school. Following his graduation, he ultimately ended up joining the army, and he was stationed in California. However, whilst he was in the army, he continued to have these violent fantasies, mostly about exhibiting power and control over women. He also started having these dreams that a Korean girl was sneaking into his bed every night trying to seduce him, and at one point he actually spoke to the army psychiatrist about these dreams and fantasies that he had, and it was as a result of this that they decided to discharge him, because what he had told the psychiatrist was so creepy and disturbing that they didn't believe he was mentally fit enough to be in the military, and so he was let go. So once again, he went back to live with his family in Corvallis in Oregon, although apparently after being discharged from the army, his mother Eileen refused to let Jerry stay in the house. She actually forced her youngest son to sleep in the shed because she didn't want him in the house, and he eventually got a job working as an electrician. He started working for this local radio station as an electrical engineer, and it was there where he met the woman who would go on to become his wife, a woman named Darcy. Now, just as a quick side note, some sources online seem to call Darcy Ralphine, but most call her Darcy, so I'm going to refer to her as Darcy in this video. I don't know whether maybe Ralphine was a middle name or something that she occasionally went by, or maybe Darcy was her middle name. But yeah, I just thought I would mention that in case any of you guys did any further reading into this case yourselves and got confused. But anyway, he met a woman named Darcy whilst he was working at the radio station. Well, I say woman, but actually she wasn't. She was a teenager. Darcy was just 17 years old, and Jerry at this point was in his early 20s. But despite this, they went on a date, seemed to hit it off, and in September of 1961, the two married. And apparently Darcy was actually pregnant with their first child at the time that they married. Jerry and Darcy Brudos had 2 children together. They had a son and a daughter, and at first the family settled into a nice house in Portland in Oregon. To an outsider's perspective, Jerry Brudos would appear to be this nice, normal, hard-working electrician and family man. But of course, no one truly knows what goes on behind closed doors. years, and it wasn't long before Jerry started exhibiting his controlling behaviours over his wife. So for example, Jerry Brudos would essentially demand that any time Darcy did any form of housework, she had to do it either naked in high-heeled shoes or in her underwear. If she was sweeping, washing up, doing the laundry, cooking a meal, she had to do it all while she was naked, even in front of their 2 little children. And apparently he would even make Darcy walk around in the underwear that he had stolen from other women in the past. In addition to that, he would regularly make Darcy pose for photographs while she was naked and she was doing the housework. He would just go around taking pictures of her. And Darcy, I don't want to use the word consented to this because I don't think that she did. I don't think that it was consensual. It was more she just complied with what he said. You know, she was only 17 years old when they got together. She was very young, he was older, so there was probably already a bit of power imbalance here. And perhaps she felt scared of what her husband might do if she refused to do what he said, and so she just went along with it. She would do as he instructed and do all of the housework naked in high heels to keep him happy. Although eventually this did start to wear off. Darcy stopped complying to her husband's demands, particularly when their second child was born in 1967. She now had another baby that she had to run around after. She didn't have the time to be stripping off all of her clothes and posing for pictures every single time she had a household chore to do. And this annoyed Jerry. He didn't like the fact that his wife wouldn't just obey him nearly as much as she used to. And so according to a documentary that I watched about this case, Jerry started doing things like taking pictures of himself naked or in women's underwear or wearing high heels and just leaving them around the house for Darcy to find to get her attention. But I mean, they had the opposite effect really. Darcy just ignored them and he hated it. He hated the fact that he didn't really have that power and control over his wife anymore, and he would just spend most of his time in the house just alone down in his basement. Whilst Darcy was upstairs with the kids, he would be in the basement with his collection of high heels and underwear and looking through all of the nude pictures of Darcy that he had taken. But it wasn't enough for him. It wasn't enough to satisfy his twisted sexual fantasies, especially now that Darcy had stopped complying. And so he decided that he would have to look elsewhere to indulge his violent sexual desires. He decided that he was going to start attacking women again. As far as we know, he did stop assaulting girls during the early years of his marriage to Darcy, probably because, again, he had her to control and dominate. But now that she had started to say no to him and refused to follow his orders, he decided that he needed to find other women that he could abuse. When Jerry was 28 years old in 1967, so this was the same year that his second child was born, he started stalking this random woman that he saw just walking down the street one day. I think she caught his attention because she was wearing these high-heeled shoes, and one night he followed her all the way to her house. He actually got on the same bus as her and got off at the same stop so that he could follow her, and she had absolutely no idea. She was none the wiser. He watched as this woman walked into her house and he waited outside for a while until all of the lights went off and it was clear that she had gone to bed, and that was when he broke in. He made his way into her house, and it's been reported that initially Jerry only intended to steal some of this woman's underwear while she was sleeping. However, as he was doing this, as he was looking for her underwear, this woman woke up and was of course panicked as this strange man was in her house. And so Jerry Brudos decided in that moment to attack her. He jumped on top of her as she was lying on her bed, put his hands around her neck and started to squeeze, and he strangled her until she was unconscious and proceeded to rape her. And after he was finished, he took her high-heeled shoes and just left. So again, you can see how his confidence in committing these attacks was really starting to build here. Again, as far as we know, this was the first time that Jerry Brudos had raped a woman. Before, during all of his attacks, he would force them to strip and take pictures of them, but this was the first time that he'd raped someone, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed feeding into another rather sick sexual fantasy of his by which he had complete control over a woman by forcing himself on her. And in fact, he would later admit that the sight of this woman's limp, unconscious body turned him on. It aroused him, and he wanted that again. He wanted to experience that feeling again, but next time he wanted to take it even further, to a far more dark and sadistic level. Next time, in addition to raping the woman that he attacked, he wanted to kill her too. He wanted that ultimate power of taking someone's life. And thus, Jerry Brudos' murder spree began. Linda Slauson was a 19-year-old girl born on the 7th of January 1949, and she lived in Aloha in Oregon with her mother and her siblings. And by 19 years old, Linda was working for a book company in which she would go around people's houses trying to sell encyclopedias, and that happens to be exactly what she was doing on the day that she tragically encountered Jerry Brudos, a sadistic sexual predator. The date was the 26th of January 1968, and that day Linda Slauson had been working. She'd been going door to door in southwest Portland asking the residents if they wanted to buy an encyclopedia. And one house that she approached was the home of the Brudos family. She actually spoke to Jerry whilst he was doing some work in his front yard, and she started her, sales pitch for the encyclopedias, and Jerry seemed interested in them, or he was pretending to be interested in them. What he was really interested in was Linda. He invited Linda to come inside the house and down to his basement where they could talk more about the books, but of course that wasn't his intention at all. And as soon as they got down to the basement, Jerry attacked. He grabbed this heavy wooden plank and hit Linda over the head with it as hard as he could, and she was knocked unconscious. And once she was unconscious, he put his hands around her neck and started to squeeze. He strangled her to death. And just as a side note, this whole time as he was killing Linda in his basement, his mother Eileen and his 2 children were upstairs in the house. Apparently his wife Darcy was at work at the time, but his mother and kids were home and he didn't care. He killed this innocent young girl whilst his children were playing upstairs. After killing Linda, he went back upstairs and acted as if nothing had just happened, and he actually gave his mother some money and asked if she could take the kids out for some food, which she did. The reason he wanted them gone was because he wanted to essentially abuse and defile Linda's dead body without being disturbed. He started undressing her, removing her underwear, and then he would start dressing her back up again in other underwear and high heels that he had previously stolen. He would proceed to take pictures of Linda's dead body, and he also committed necrophilia. He raped Linda's corpse. Eventually, Jerry Brudos realized that he needed to come up with a plan here. He obviously couldn't keep Linda's body, so he needed to figure out what he was going to do with her, and he ultimately decided that he was going to dump her body in the Long Tom River in Oregon. But before he did so, he actually took a hacksaw and decided to literally cut off one of Linda's feet. He wanted to keep this foot as a souvenir, a trophy, a reminder of what he had done to her. And sickeningly, he would actually keep this foot in his freezer in the basement, and every now and then he would take it out and dress it in a high heel and masturbate, thinking about what he had done to Linda. Later that same day that he killed Linda, once all of his family had gone to bed, he carried her body to his car, drove her to the Long Tom River, and before he threw her into the water, he actually tied her body to this heavy bit of vehicle machinery so that when he threw her in, she wouldn't float. Her body would be dragged under and hopefully never found. And sure enough, she wasn't. To this day, the body of Linda Slauson has never been recovered. Her family have never been able to lay her to rest. Following Linda Slauson's horrific murder, Jerry actually moved house with his family. They moved out of Portland and relocated down south to Salem. He died Darcy and the kids moved into a new house which had a garage separate from the house, and Jerry knew exactly what he was going to use this garage for. Similar to the basement in his old house, this garage was going to be a place where he could hold future victims hostage and kill them. He knew that he wanted to kill again. He got such sexual gratification from killing Linda that he knew it would only be a matter of time before he claimed his second victim. And that time came about 10 months after Linda's murder on the 26th of November 1968. That day, Jerry had been working as an electrician in Lebanon in Oregon, and when he finished work that evening, as he was driving home, he spotted what looked like a broken down car on Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany, and standing next to this car was a young woman. This young woman was Jan Whitney. She was a 23-year-old college student with the University of Oregon, and on this particular day she had apparently been driving home from university for Thanksgiving, but she would never make it there, as when Jerry Brudos saw her next to her broken down vehicle on Interstate 5, he quickly decided that she was going to be his next victim. He pulled his car over next to Jan's and pretended to be this good Samaritan that wanted to help her fix her car. However, he said that they would have to go to his house to pick up some tools first and then return to her vehicle so that he could fix it. So Jan, obviously very grateful to this stranger for helping her, willingly got into Jerry's car and he drove back to his home in Salem. Once they arrived, Jerry got out and he told Jan to wait in the car, saying that he would be right back with the tools. However, when he did return, he quickly jumped into the back seat behind Jan and he looped this leather luggage strap around her neck and began to pull. And during the struggle, Brudos shut one end of the leather strap in the car door, so it was still tight around Jan's neck and she was trapped. She couldn't free herself from this noose, and whilst Jan was fighting for breath while she was dying, Jerry Brudos proceeded to rape her inside of the car. After the rape and after she was dead, Brudos carried Jan's body into his garage where he did the same sort of things to her as he did to his first victim, Linda Slauson. He would repeatedly undress her and then dress her up again in different sets of underwear and high heels. He would take pictures of her body. He would commit necrophilia, and he kept Jan's body in his garage for a couple of days after her death. He actually hoisted her up from this pulley on the ceiling of his garage and just left her there hanging for his own sick sexual pleasure. And during this time, he actually cut off one of Jan's breasts because, according to one source, he planned to use it as a paperweight. So again, like Linda Slauson's foot, he was keeping Jan's breast as like a souvenir of this murder. It would appear as though Jerry Brudos initially planned to keep Jan Whitney's body in his garage for some time before disposing of her. However, that time was cut short when a couple of days after she was killed, a car accidentally crashed into the side of his garage and it created a bit of a hole in the wall. Now, police were called as a result of this accident, and a police officer was sent to the Brudos' home to assess the damage to the garage, I suppose. And luckily for Brudos, somehow this officer didn't actually see Jan Whitney's body whilst it was inside of the garage. But it was after this accident when Brudos knew that it was time for him to dump her body too. So he tied her to this heavy railroad iron, and just like with Linda Slauson, he threw her into the Willamette River. And according to one report, he also threw Linda Slauson's severed foot into the river too, alongside Jan's body, because the foot by this point had started to decompose after several months of being stored in his freezer. In addition to that, Jerry also towed Jan's car off of Interstate 5 and just abandoned it at a nearby rest stop. And the mystery surrounding Jan Whitney's sudden disappearance remained unsolved for about 8 months, until July of 1969, when finally her body was recovered. Jerry's third murder would occur the following year in March of 1969, so only about 4 months after the last. Karen Sprinker was a 19-year-old woman and a chemistry student at the Oregon State University, and on March the 27th, 1969, she was just walking through the parking lot of a department store in Oregon as she was on her way to meet her mother for lunch. However, she would never arrive at this lunch lunch because while she was in the parking lot, she was approached by Jerry Brudos, who immediately threatened Karen with a gun. Now, some sources state that Jerry was actually dressed in women's clothing at the time of this attack, and he forced a terrified Karen into his car and abducted her. He drove her to his home in Salem and took her into his garage workshop, and there he tortured her essentially. According to one source, he asked Karen if she was a virgin, and when she responded yes, he proceeded to rape her, despite her telling him that she was on her period at the time. He then started taking pictures of Karen. He forced her to put on different sets of underwear and high heels and pose for pictures, including this picture that is on the screen right now. This is one that Jerry Brudos took of Karen in his garage, and it would appear as though from the picture that Karen was probably trying to remain as calm as possible. Perhaps she thought that if she just complied and she did what this man said, then maybe there was a chance that he would let her go unharmed. But of course, there was no way that Jerry Brudos was going to do that. After taking countless pictures of Karen, he tied her hands behind her back, placed a rope around her neck, and asked if the rope was too tight. And when Karen replied that it was, he looped the rope over a beam in the ceiling and started to pull. And he watched as Karen started to lift from the ground by this rope around her neck until eventually she died. Jerry Brudos would later go on to describe Karen's death. He said that once he pulled the rope, he watched as Karen, quote, kicked a little and died. He enjoyed watching Karen struggle, watching her fight for every last breath while she was hanging from his ceiling wearing high-heeled shoes. Following Karen's death, as usual, he committed necrophilia with her body, and then just like the previous victims, he mutilated her. He cut off both of her breasts and actually attempted to make a plastic mold of them so that he could keep that as a trophy once her breasts had, started to decompose. He also took even more pictures of Karen once she was dead, and then once he was satisfied with how he had defiled Karen's body, he tied her to another heavy bit of enginery, drove her to the Willamette River, and threw her into the water. Now, as all of this was happening, as Jerry Brudos was committing these murders, the police were looking into the disappearances of these young women. The families of Linda Slauson, Jan Whitney, and Karen Sprinker all reported the girls as missing, but Jerry Brudos had gotten very good at covering his tracks. He was clever enough to think to, essentially tie an anchor to their bodies before throwing them into the river so that they would drown and hopefully never be found. So the police were trying to investigate these disappearances, trying to work out what had happened to these three missing women, but they didn't really have that much to go on. And remember, this was the late 60s. This was a time before DNA and phone records and CCTV and stuff like that. And so naturally, again, with each kill, with each murder that Jerry was getting away with, his confidence in committing these heinous crimes was just building and building. And the gaps of time between each attack started to become shorter and shorter. However, the next two victims that he tried to abduct and kill would actually be survivors of his. The next two attacks were unsuccessful, and the targets were able to escape with their lives. Less than a month after Karen Sprinker was murdered, on the 21st of April 1969, a 24-year-old woman named Sharon Wood had spent the day at work. Sharon worked as a secretary in Portland, and when she finished work that day, she headed to the parking garage where her car was parked. She'd actually misplaced her car keys, so she went down to the parking lot to see if perhaps she'd left the keys in the ignition in her vehicle or something. Although by the time she got to the parking lot, she actually couldn't even remember what floor she had parked her car on. So she was wandering around the parking garage looking for her vehicle, and eventually Sharon noticed this man, this stranger, kind of lurking a short distance behind her, and this man made Sharon feel uneasy because she noticed that every single time she would turn around and look at him, he would suddenly turn around too. But then once she turned her back to him and carried on walking, he would continue walking behind her, so it seemed like he was following her. This continued for a little while until eventually Sharon felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around and it was that man, that that stranger. And at first, he was apparently acting as if he was lost too. He couldn't find his car, but then all of a sudden, he produced a gun and he pointed it right at Sharon and said, quote, "If you don't scream, I won't shoot you." This stranger in the parking lot was, of course, Jerry Brudos, and he wanted Sharon to be his next victim. But Sharon did not follow Jerry's orders to stay silent. She started shouting and screaming, just trying to make as much noise as she possibly could to get someone's attention. And this clearly angered Jerry because he went up behind Sharon and wrapped his arm around her neck. He seemed to be trying to get her into some sort of chokehold position, probably so that he could control her and drag her back to his car. But my God, Sharon was not willing to go down without a fight, and as his arm was around her neck, she actually started biting his thumb as hard as she could, and she was biting down on his thumb so hard that her jaw actually locked and she couldn't release it. She couldn't have stopped biting him even if she wanted to now. And obviously this was hurting Jerry Brudos, this was painful, so he pulled Sharon's hair back and just began banging her head on the concrete floor repeatedly, trying to get her off of his thumb. And when she finally did, when her jaw unlocked and his thumb was free, he ran back to his car with his gun and drove away as quickly as he could. He just fled. Clearly he panicked because this attempted abduction obviously hadn't gone to plan. He thought that by threatening Sharon with a gun, she would go with him without making a fuss, but she didn't, and he was probably worried that if he didn't run now, someone would catch him, the police would catch him. And so, because this attack was unsuccessful, Jerry Brudos soon tried again. He tried to attack another woman, or child, I should say. Just the day after the attempted abduction of Sharon Wood, Jerry Brudos attacked a 15-year-old girl named Gloria Jean Smith. Gloria was actually on her way to school when Jerry Brudos, once again armed with a gun, approached her, grabbed her arm, and ordered her to walk with him towards his car. Apparently, he said to Gloria, quote, "I want you to come with me. I won't hurt you. I won't rape you." However, as they were walking to his car, Gloria noticed a woman in her front garden tending to her plants, and she just decided to run away from Brudos and towards this woman for help. And Brudos didn't run after her again. Instead, he panicked. He ran back to his vehicle and drove away quickly. So now that's 2 failed abduction attempts in a row for Jerry Brudos, and he realized that this tactic of, approaching women in public places and threatening them with a gun was just too risky. Yes, it worked with Karen Sprinker, but unless the victims did the same as her and they complied and went off with him without making a fuss out of pure fear, then it just wasn't going to work, and the chances of him being caught were too high. What he decided he needed to do in order to lure in his next victim was to trick them into getting into his vehicle somehow, just like he had done with his second victim, Jan Whitney, by pretending like he was going to help her with her broken down car. And as it would turn out, changing up his tactic would work for him, as his next target would not be so lucky as to escape Jerry Brudos with her life. Jerry Brudos somehow acquired this fake police badge, and what he started doing was going around parking garages pretending to be an undercover policeman in the hopes that he could arrest a young woman that he could then kidnap. And on the 23rd of April 1969, Linda Saley tragically encountered Jerry Brudos as he was doing just that. Linda Saley was a 22-year-old woman. She was a part-time student and a secretary for this removals firm, and she was actually engaged to be married. She had a fiance, and in fact on this particular day, the 23rd of April, she had gone to the Lloyd Centre shopping mall in Portland because it was her fiance's birthday and she wanted to buy him some presents. So she did her shopping, she brought her presents, and then at the end of her shopping trip, she made her way to the parking garage of the shopping mall where her car was parked, and that was where she stumbled upon Jerry Brudos. Jerry liked what he saw when he spotted Linda because she was wearing high-heeled shoes, and so he approached her, showed her his badge, and claimed that he worked as a security officer for the shopping mall, and he accused Linda of stealing from the mall, and so she needed to come down to the police station with him for questioning. So of course Linda complied. She had no reason to think that he was lying about being a policeman, so she got into his car and Jerry started driving away. But quickly Linda would have realized realized that he wasn't in fact driving to a police station. Instead, Jerry drove Linda to his garage at his home in Salem. She would have known at this point that she had been tricked and kidnapped. Once inside of the garage, Brudos immediately tied Linda up so that she couldn't move, and then unbelievably, he just went into the house because his dinner was ready. So he went and had dinner with his family whilst Linda was tied up in his garage. I mean, can you even imagine how frightened she must have been, being trapped in this man's garage, not knowing what the hell he was going to do to her? It's the thing of nightmares. Now, sources state that during the time that Jerry was eating his dinner in the house, Linda had managed to somehow free herself from the restraints. However, it would appear as though she didn't have time to make an escape before Brudos returned to the garage. Once he returned, he placed a leather strap around her neck, and just like he had done with previous victims, he attached this strap to the ceiling and began lifting her from the ground, enjoying himself as he watched Linda struggle. He also proceeded to take pictures of her, and once she was unconscious from being suspended from the ceiling, he raped her whilst he strangled her to death using the strap of a postal bag. Once she was dead, he suspended Linda's lifeless body from the ceiling once again, and he proceeded to mutilate her. Although this time he tried something that he had never tried before with his previous victim. He wanted to kind of experiment on Linda's body. He got these hypodermic needles and he put them in the sides of her rib cage underneath her armpits, and attached to these needles he put electrical nodes. What he hoped this would achieve was send obviously electricity through Linda's dead body so that she would almost kind of come alive again, or that her body would jolt or produce seizure-like symptoms. But it didn't work. All it did was burn Linda's skin, and so he quickly gave up with this sick experiment, and so he did the usual things that he did with his victims. He committed necrophilia. Apparently he created a mold of Linda's breasts too, although he didn't cut them off to do it this time. He would actually later say that he had no interest in removing Linda's breasts because her nipples were, quote, too pink, and he didn't like that. So he just created a mold of them, and then just the day after her murder, he tied Linda's body to a heavy piece of vehicle machinery and threw her into the Willamette River. But Linda Saley's body didn't stay hidden in the river for long. Just a couple of weeks after her murder, her body was discovered in the water by two fishermen. And when police were notified of this horrific discovery, they actually decided to conduct a thorough search of the rest of the river, because as we know, Linda was not the first woman to go missing in Portland in Oregon. Women had been going missing at an alarming rate, and now that Linda Saley had been found murdered, the police did start to wonder if maybe they had a serial killer on their hands. A serial killer who was dumping their victims' bodies in the Willamette River, the Long Tom River. So an underwater search and rescue team were brought in, and sure enough, just 2 days after Linda's body was found by the fishermen, a second body was recovered from the water. This was the body of Karen Sprinker, who had vanished just a few months earlier. Now, very quickly, the police linked these two murders. They were certain that Linda Saley and Karen Sprinker had been killed by the same man, not just because they were both found in the same river and they had both been weighed down with a piece of machinery, but also because upon closer examination of their bodies, they realised that they had both been bound with rope, and this rope had been tied with the same kind of knot, a knot which the police knew was often used by electricians when they were working with electrical wires. So this gave the police their first clue. Could this mean that the killer worked as an electrician? So that was one line of inquiry that the police decided to pursue in an attempt to identify the murderer, looking into local electricians. In addition to that, what they also started to do was take statements from the students at the University of Oregon, the university that Karen Sprinker attended, just to see if maybe one of the students had any information, any idea who might have done this to her. And many of the female students did actually tell the police that in the last couple of months, they had been receiving phone calls from the same man who claimed that he was a Vietnam vet And he was calling all of these different female students, asking them if they wanted to go on a date with him. Now, most of the women would say no, or literally just hang up the phone on this man. However, one of the students did tell the police that actually she agreed. She said yes to a date with this Vietnam vet. However, she said that this date was just really strange, to be honest. This guy really creeped her out, because during the date, he apparently made a bizarre comment to her. He said something along the lines of, quote, "How do you know that I'm not going to murder you and dump you in the river?" Which, yeah, she just thought was really creepy. It made her very uncomfortable. And so after speaking to this female student, the police asked her to get back in touch with them immediately if she should ever hear from this man again, if he rang her again. They actually asked her, if he did ring again, to agree to go on a second date with him, but instead of her showing up to this date, it would be the police. And sure enough, as luck would have it, the Vietnam vet did make contact just a week after Linda Saley's body was found on the 18th of May 1969. He called this girl, this female student, and asked her to meet with him for a second date that same evening, which she said yes to. However, obviously, when he arrived at the place where they agreed to meet, it was in fact the detectives who were there to greet him. And what they learned when they did meet him was that his name was, of course, Jerry Brudos. He was the Vietnam vet. One of his many tactics in order to find potential victims did include ringing female students at the Oregon University on the off chance that someone might agree to go on a date with him. So the detectives began asking this Jerry Brudos some questions relating to the murders of the two young women whose bodies had just been found in the Willamette River. The murders of Linda Saley and Karen Sprinker. However, he denied having any involvement in either cases, and the police didn't have any solid evidence at this point to suggest otherwise, to suggest that he was lying, and so they were forced to just let him go after this brief questioning. But I mean, given the fact that he'd made that really creepy comment to the student he'd gone on a date with, the police did decide to put Jerry Brudos under surveillance whilst they looked further into him, into his life. And as they did so, they discovered that, number one, he was an electrician, so already this was looking like a potentially promising lead because of the electrical knots that had been used to tie up the bodies of Linda Saley and Karen Sprinker. And number two, what the police also uncovered through looking into Jerry Brudos' background was that he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital back when he was 18 years old for attacking two young women, two girls. So he really did seem like someone who would have been capable of carrying out these murders. The detectives had now identified a top suspect, and it was after they identified Jerry Brudos as a suspect in these murders when the police decided to go and speak to both Sharon Wood and Gloria Jean Smith, the two women who were attacked and almost abducted by a man in Portland just days before Linda Saley was killed and who survived. The police believed that these attempted abductions may have been linked to these homicides. So they showed both Sharon and Gloria a picture of Jerry Brudos as part of a photo lineup, and both of them picked out Jerry as being the man that attacked them. So evidence against Jerry Brudos really seemed to be mounting. Finally, the net was closing in on him. And because Gloria and Sharon had identified him as being their attacker, whilst the police still couldn't arrest him yet for the murders, they could apprehend him for these two crimes instead. And so on the 29th of May 1969, 30-year-old Jerry Brudos was arrested for assault while armed with a dangerous weapon. It actually took the police a little while to find him. It seemed as though he was hiding from them. He'd obviously realised that he was a suspect at this point after they questioned him, but eventually they did find him. He was actually found by some highway patrol officers as the Brudos family were driving in their car towards Portland. His wife Darcy was driving the car and her husband Jerry was hiding underneath a blanket in the back seat. And it was then when he was arrested and taken into custody. Jerry Brudos was interviewed by the detectives over a number of days, and initially he once again protested his innocence, saying that he had nothing to do with any of the murders. But eventually, as the questioning continued, would you believe it, he gave in. A couple of days after his arrest on the 3rd of June 1969, Jerry Brudos finally admitted to the investigators that he was the guy they were looking for. He was a serial killer. He confessed not only to the murders of Linda Sayley and Karen Sprinker, but also to the murders of 2 other missing women, Linda Slauson and Jan Whitney, whose bodies had not even been found yet. As we discussed earlier, Linda Slauson's body was never found, and Jan Whitney's body wasn't recovered until the month following Brudos' arrest in July of 1969. Jerry Brudos openly confessed to the detectives that he had taken the lives of 4 innocent young women, and he went through each and every murder with them, detailing exactly how he carried them out and what he did to each victim. And I think what's important to note here is that Jerry Brudos was not confessing out of guilt. He never showed even an ounce of remorse for what he had done. He simply did not care. To him, these women that he had killed were not people, they were objects. They were his toys to use and abuse as he pleased. In fact, according to a documentary that I watched about this case, Jerry Brudos even described his victims as being like candy wrappers. Once you're done with them, once you're satisfied, you just throw them away like they're nothing, because to him, these women were nothing. So he wasn't confessing because he felt guilty and he wanted to give the families of the victims those answers and closure. He was confessing for notoriety. Like I said, he tried to deny the killings at first, but when he realized that actually he wasn't getting away with this anymore, I think he simply thought, well, I may as well confess and gain notoriety for what I've done. We know that Jerry Brudos was someone who very much craved attention, don't we? And let's be honest, the amount of attention he would get from this would be huge. Meanwhile, as these interviews with Brudos were taking place, the police also obtained a search warrant for his property. They got a warrant to search his car, which he had very recently thoroughly cleaned, by the way, so clearly he had been trying to get rid of evidence before his arrest. And they got a warrant to search his house and of course his garage, and it was during these searches when the police obtained a mountain of evidence, particularly evidence in his garage, obviously. In his garage workshop, they found the many Polaroid pictures that Brudos had taken. He'd hidden them behind a bench in his workshop, and of course these photographs were of his victims. Photos he had made them pose for when they were still alive, wearing different sets of underwear and high heels, and as we know, he also took several pictures of them when they were dead too. The police even found one picture that Jerry had taken of one of his victims where he'd actually accidentally captured himself in it too. Basically, he was using a mirror to try and take a picture of the reflection of one of his victims' genitalia. He'd positioned the camera so that it would capture a picture of her private parts, and what he, I guess, didn't realise at the time was that his face was in the shot too. And it's honestly one of the most disturbing pictures I think I've ever seen. So they found all of these horrific pictures. They also found items that belonged to the victims that Jerry Brudos had kept. So for example, they found Jan Whitney's car keys. If you recall, he towed her car to a nearby rest stop after he murdered her, and he kept the keys, probably because, again, they acted as another trophy for him. They also discovered rope, which had the same kind of electrical style knots which had been used to tie up the victims, and they found countless sets of underwear that Jerry had stolen and collected, as well as about 40 pairs of high-heeled shoes. Now, despite the fact that Jerry Brudos had confessed to all 4 murders, it was ultimately decided to only charge him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was charged with the murders of Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sayley, but not with the murder of his first victim, Linda Slauson. It was determined that they just didn't have enough evidence to charge him with Linda's murder because her body was never found. And although they did discover pictures of Linda's body that Jerry had taken, apparently these pictures of Linda were mainly, if not all, of the lower parts of her body, so like her legs and her ankles and her feet, and they couldn't prove that these pictures had been taken post-mortem, after death. So these pictures of Linda Slauson were, I suppose, evidence that she had been in his basement, but not evidence that he had killed her. And obviously they didn't have her body either, so yeah, they just didn't feel like they could charge him with the murder of Linda Slauson, despite the fact that he fully admitted to killing her too. Honestly, that aspect of the case does seem a bit bizarre to me. I still feel like there was probably sufficient evidence to charge him with Linda Slauson's murder, but I mean, what do I know? I suppose a no-body murder case is really, really hard to prosecute. Anyway, he was charged with 3 counts of murder, and initially he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Jerry Brudos was trying to claim that he was criminally insane, he was mentally ill, and therefore he could not be held responsible for his actions. However, when he was assessed by psychiatrists, they concluded that he was not insane and that he very much had control over his actions. He was fully capable of making his own decisions, and therefore he could be held accountable. And so it was following these assessments when Jerry Brudos changed his plea. He changed his plea to guilty. I mean, what was the point in pleading not guilty with the evidence stacked against him, including his confession? And following his guilty plea on the 27th of June 1969, he was sentenced to 3 terms of life imprisonment, and with that he was sent to the Oregon State Prison. Now, Jerry Brudos was actually not the only one who faced the court in relation to these crimes. His wife, Darcy Brudos, was also arrested, and she was actually charged with being an accessory to murder. Now, Darcy had always claimed that she had absolutely no idea what her husband had done to these poor women. She had no idea that the man that she was married to was a serial killer. But to be honest, the police just found that really hard to believe, because as we know, he committed these murders in either the basement or the garage of the family home. So how on earth could Darcy have not known about it? But the reason she was charged with being an accessory to murder was because a neighbour told the police that they had actually seen Darcy, I think, either help bundle one of the victims into the garage or assist Jerry with moving one of the bodies out of the garage. So Darcy was charged. She pleaded not guilty, and at her trial in the fall of 1969, it was determined that this witness, this neighbour, was essentially unreliable. They were discredited, and at the end of her trial, Darcy was found not guilty. So in the eyes of the law, she was innocent. I would be really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on that though in the comments. Do you think that Darcy had involvement, or that she at least knew about Jerry's crimes? Darcy ended up divorcing Jerry whilst he was behind bars. She changed her name and she moved away with her children, never to be heard of again really. It's not known where she or her kids are now. Understandably, she'd want to keep them under the radar. Following his conviction, Jerry Brudos did try to appeal his sentence numerous times over the years, and he went before the parole board. However, these attempts were always unsuccessful and he was kept behind bars. He stayed behind bars right up until his death. Jerry Brudos died from liver cancer on the 28th of March 2006. At the time, he was 67 years old, and he had spent a total of 37 years in prison for his murders. And that is it for this case. That is the case of the shoe fetish slayer, or the lust killer as he also became known in the media, Jerry Brudos. A lot of people believe that Jerry Brudos probably had more victims than the 4 that we've talked about in this video. I'm not sure if I personally believe that, because I just feel like he would have confessed to additional murders if he did have more victims. Like I said earlier, Jerry Brudos was someone who always craved attention, probably because of the extreme lack of attention that he got from his mother when he was a kid. He craved attention, he craved notoriety. To him, these brutal killings were something to be proud of. So I personally think that he would have told the police if there were others, but maybe I'm wrong, who knows? Maybe he did have more victims and he only decided to tell the police about 4 of them because that way, in a sense, he still maintains some of the power and control. Do let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And of course, feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can pop them down below in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box if you would prefer to go through that. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.